Hey everybody, my name is Wes Ellis. I'm a pastor and a theologian, and today I want to share a kind of quick overview of, and when I say quick, I mean really quick because we can't cover everything. But I want to talk about practical theology. What is practical theology, and a little bit of where it came from. Now, my disclaimer here is that I am looking at this through a specific lens. There are other ways of looking at practical theology and its history. But for our purposes, I just want you to have a basic overview of what I understand to be the overall core tasks of practical theology. I'm going to get a lot of this from Richard Osmer and by extension through Andrew Root and others. I'm going to be explaining kind of a way of looking at practical theology. Before I really get into what the core tasks of practical theology are, I want to talk about some history. So there's gonna be some words on the screen here, and hopefully this is a helpful guide through this conversation. So the question I want to talk about is what is practical theology? And it helps, I think, to start with what is theology. It's important that we consider practical theology to be a work of theology, and that isn't always the case. It's not actually always how everyone looks at it. But I want to look at it as a task of theology, which means practical theology is not just doing other people's theology or applying theology, but actually doing the work of theology. So, what is the work of theology? Theology begins in God. This is Beth Falco Jones, a theologian, and in her perspective, she says theology begins in God. That's the theo in theology. Theology comes from two words, theo and logos, God and word. So we could say very crudely that theology is words about God. But she says it begins in God, the theo part, who is unprovable, transcendent, and unutterable. And through God's grace and goodness, it continues as we seek to understand matters of faith, matters that remain unprovable, but nonetheless become visible and practical in lives transformed by the gospel. I think that's a really helpful beginning point of how to think about theology. It's important here to note that theology begins in a God who is unprovable and transcendent. That makes the whole words about part kind of difficult. And especially if we consider theology to be a body of knowledge, it becomes really hard because we tend to think that knowledge is something provable. Particularly, that's what it means to know something in our modern age, is to know it objectively, to know it and be able to prove it, replicate it, and disprove it if we have to. But that's what we usually think about when we think about knowledge. Another way of looking at this comes from Jürgen Moltmann. I really like the way he frames this. He says, real theology, which means the knowledge of God, again, words about God, knowledge of God, finds expression in thanks, praise, and adoration. This is what he would call the doxological element of theology. That theology is, in essence, not just the kind of knowledge that's expressed in provability, in verifiability, in replicability or measurability, but in praise and thanks and adoration. That makes theology a very different form of knowledge, a very different discipline than maybe what we would normally consider to be scientific knowledge or social science or whatever. So theology is unique in a lot of ways. And what makes it really difficult is that we live in an age beyond, we're in a post-enlightened age. We live after the Enlightenment. Rene Descartes, a very important philosopher in the 1500s, 1600s, he reshaped Western epistemology. Epistemology means our knowledge about knowledge. So he reshaped the way we think about how we understand things. And another way you could think about this is he reshaped what we considered to be a legitimate form of knowledge by shifting the foundation knowledge from external authority to a reasoning subject. So, in other words, knowledge is something that happens in the individual we as selves we understand ourselves to be knowing subjects. The self is somewhere inside of us and not outside of us. Knowledge does not come from outside. It's not just an apprehension of the physical, empirical world, but it is something that happens within us. So we can't just appeal to authority. We have to do the work ourselves. There's a lot to this. Through radical doubt, he arrived at the cogito or the cogito or cogito. I think, therefore I am, as an indubitable starting point, and argued that clear and distinct ideas grasped by reason ground certain knowledge. This moved elevated rational certainty and established modern concerns with subjectivity and epistemic foundations, and set the stage for later debates between rationalism and empiricism. Uh, yeah. So that's a kind of basic overview of Descartes. And he is, in many ways, a catalytic thinker for the Enlightenment project. He had a lot of help. There were plenty of other thinkers that really created this seismic shift. Now, I do want to note for a second that there is not a clear consensus about about the Enlightenment and how that works. But what there is a consensus about is that there has been a seismic shift in our understanding about knowledge. So, skipping ahead here, there's just a few other thinkers that we want to look at. John Locke, Isaac Newton, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, David Hume, Immanuel Kant. These are all really important key figures in the Enlightenment that helped construct the kind of modern epistemic environment in which practical theology was born. What happened before practical theology, before we had to put adjectives before theology at all, is this Enlightenment. And what happened was theology got demoted, more or less. This is, again, a simplistic way of describing this, but I think an accurate one, that theology used to be a trusted discipline for asking questions about the meaning of human life and the meaning of existence. And in the Enlightenment, the goalposts kind of moved. We had to now provide verifiable scientific rationality for things, and so we began to lose trust in disciplines that we used to trust. We lost trust in disciplines that fell on more on the subjective side of the subjective objective continuum. So theology counts as one of those things. Things like theology and art and storytelling and philosophy became kind of second tier. Maybe, and we of course we didn't lose those things completely, but we just didn't really trust them with the questions we used to trust them with. But it's important to note that we didn't stop asking those questions about the meaning of life, not just the what, but the why. Before I get there, I want to just read a couple of quotes here. For the advent of psychoanalysis demoted religious claims. This is Hannah Reichel, theologian from Princeton Theological Seminary. Hannah says the advent of psychoanalysis demoted religious claims further to symbols of the subconscious or understood them as existential coping strategies with contingency. In other words, we really began to see, and by the way, psychoanalysis is kind of singled out here, but it can be a representative or a placeholder for lots of other social sciences. But the idea is that the questions we were still asking about the meaning of human life no longer were trusted with theologians, but were now being entrusted to scientists and scientists who birthed disciplines like psychoanalysis and psychology. So now psychology basically comes in and says, "Hey, you're still asking those questions. We can answer them, but we'll do it differently than the philosophers did. We'll give you empirical evidence. We'll give you scientific rationality." And so they really kind of theology again got demoted and kind of unseated by psychology and different social sciences. Um, and whoops. another important feature of this is James Fowler, a practical theologian, who says psychologists have begun to play the role in our society that storytellers and myth makers once played in primitive and classical cultures. So this has been observed by others as well, that uh, because of this seismic shift in our epistemology, the epistemic landscape of the Western world, we were still asking questions about meaning, but assigning them to social sciences, assigning them to disciplines that could centralize the human knowing subject rather than the external transcendent God. This became a problem for theology, and so for the first time in history, as far as we can, in the Western world, we'll say, uh, theology has to justify its own existence. So along comes Frederick Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher is often considered the father of modern theology. He was a German Reformed theologian, a philosopher, and a biblical scholar, best known for his efforts to bring Protestant Christianity into meaningful dialogue with the challenges and critiques of the Enlightenment. Schleiermacher, in essence, takes up a project of defending or justifying the necessity of theology for scholasticism, for the world in general. And one of his big contributions is this book. It's called A Brief Outline of the Study of Theology. And in that, he gives this kind of scheme where philosophical theology, think systematic theology, constructive theology, these kinds of things provide kind of the root of the tree. Historical theology provides kind of the trunk, so think church history, even biblical studies. And then practical theology is the crown, is the queen, the crown of the theological enterprise. That practical theology, what it essentially does is it takes what the philosophical theologians do, the historical theologians do, and it applies it to the church, making it useful, meaningful, and expedient for the church. Now, this is sort of what it ends up looking like is that biblical theology, systematic theology, historical theology, all these other theological disciplines sort of filtered through practical theology and applied to the church. The problem with this, however, is that practical theology doesn't really get to have its own say or um, uh, its own theoretical content. What practical theology just does is it's the mechanism by which, or the technology, you could say, by which we apply theology to the practical existence of the world. In other words, it's a way of insisting that theology is and must be practical. Now, there's been a lot. There's a whole bunch of history we're just gonna skip here, so you have to know that. But there's been in the last several decades a huge push against this kind of way of looking at it. What this model did for Schleiermacher was it reduced practical theology to applied theology. And that's not what practical theologians now tend to understand to be their job. As a practical theologian, I don't see my role as simply applying the theoretical content of other disciplines to the lived experience of congregations and people. As a practical theologian, I see my job as actually saying something different. Again, words about God, saying something different about God and humanity and creation than I could say from the vantage point of biblical, systematic, historical theologies. In other words, I think practical theology has its own contribution to make, and I'm saying that I'm echoing the critiques that have come up, especially in the kind of Princeton School of Practical Theology, that there's a conglomeration of theologians. Really important in this was a theologian named James Loder. And since then, Ray Anderson, Andrew Root, Rick Osmer becomes perhaps the most important person in sort of defining the Princeton School. Gordon McCoskey, Kenda Creasy Dean. There's some names that really should be known and elevated in this. But basically, the big contribution from those folks and from Osmer and Andrew Root in particular, is that practical theology needs to be able to speak of not just applying other disciplines, but actually cutting to the core of reality, cutting to the core of what does it mean? What do we mean when we say God? And so, a way of saying this, and oh, here again, Schleiermacher practical theology just gets to be applied theology, and it's not really distinctive in its own sense. And Here's those theologians: James Loder, Ray Anderson, Rick Osmer, Candid Creasy Dean, Andrew Root. I would say John Swinton is another theologian you should know about in this. They've challenged this assumption, insisting that practical theology has its own contribution to make. Practical theology, here's a way of saying this. Practical theology is not about making theology practical. In other words, it's not just what Schleiermacher was arguing for when he was justifying its existence. It is about insisting that the practical is fundamentally theological. That, in other words, and this is a little bit semantic challenge here, but when we talk about the practical, that is human experience, created the living world, we are talking about something that is infused with theological meaning. It is a location for divine encounter. And so practical theology becomes the task of encountering God in lived experience. So that's I think a better definition than or one that has emerged from criticism and sympathetic criticism of Frederick Schleiermacher's original scheme from his basic outline. So practical theology is about making theology is not about making theology practical. It's about insisting that the practical is fundamentally theological. So here's the 4 tasks. According to Rick Osmer, and this, by the way, was never intended to be a model for practical theology, although it certainly can operate that way. And it has provided a framework for many people to kind of see it. I think it's better to think of this as kind of a rubric. What Rick Osmer was doing was not prescribing this is how you must do practical theology. Instead, what he was doing was he was saying that this is what good practical theologians do. If practical theology is happening and it's happening well, it is happening with these 4 core tasks in operation. That is the descriptive, interpretive, normative, and pragmatic tasks. So the descriptive task is it involves carefully observing and gathering information about what is happening in a particular situation. It is, in essence, the question, what is going on? So we want to look at the practical, the lived experience of human beings, and ask ourselves, what is going on? So that is the descriptive task. And this is, it's important to say that this descriptive task is not yet interpretive. Now, that in itself is difficult to say because you can never just observe without observing from a specific location. So there's certainly a very legitimate critique of trying to bifurcate these two things. Description and interpretation are always deeply intertwined. But there is a sense that we can interrogate our own assumptions before we begin interpreting. So part of description may be simply recognizing the assumptions you take into it. But at best, what we're doing is we're not trying to pretend that we're being objective in the descriptive task, but we are trying to reserve judgment until the interpretive task. The interpretive task begins to ask the question, why? So if we've observed a situation and we've described it well, thick description, then we can ask the question, why is this going on? Why is this happening? And so the interpretive task looks to the situation that has been described and seeks to interpret why the situation is the way it is. This task is interdisciplinary. That means that as theologians, we have to recognize that we are not social scientists and that social scientists may have been asking these questions before we got there. Social scientists may have very important lenses to help us understand the situation at hand. So this is where things like psychology, ethnography, even biology become really helpful to us. And it's important that we never quite become a sociologist when we do this. I think it's actually important that we don't, but also important to recognize that we can't, that we are always doing it as theologians or ministers. But as theologians, we want to employ the help of these other disciplines to help us truly and deeply understand why a situation is happening. Often we can understand that any situation has a historical, psychological, epistemological, ethnographic history that can inform what led to the situation that we see. The third task is the normative task. Now, this one's kind of tricky because normative can sound kind of heavy-handed a little bit. That we're gonna, as though we're going to determine, finally give a final answer on what ought to be happening. And there is, I think, some issue in framing it as what ought to be happening. That is indeed how Rick Osmer sort of frames it in a nuanced way. But he frames it as kind of, okay, so we've asked why, or we've asked what, we've asked why, now we're asking, well, what ought to be happening? If I've observed a situation and I've addressed how it came to be, now I want to say, should it have been different? What ought to be happening? Uh, Andrew Root kind of sympathetically critiquing Osmer's description of this says it may be better to see Osmer's normative question, what ought to be happening, not solely as an ethical frame, but also as a revelatory one. That is, asking, what ought to be happening? What should we perceive of reality, ourselves, the church, our practice, and conceptions of God, now that God has encountered us? Now that God has entered into history through Jesus Christ, how do we understand this situation? In other words, a better question for this is perhaps, where is God in this? And this is also an interdisciplinary task because doctrine and the history of theology, these are where the systematic theologians and the constructive theologians and the contextual theologians can really help us understand things. People who have already made it their project to speak of God can really inform us as to how to interpret what kind of God is active in this situation that we're addressing. So that's the normative task. It is the reason why normative is still a helpful word, even though it sounds a bit too heavy-handed, perhaps, is because it reminds us that what is normative is not our interpretation or even the action we decide to take, but what is normative is God's action. God's action is deterministic of everything we do. This is a specifically reformed understanding of all of this and a reformed understanding of the relationship between divine and human action is that God acts primarily. God is the norm, the thing that determines, that orients all other forms of knowledge and all other action. And human action is responsive. And so that leads us to the fourth task of practical theology, which is the pragmatic task. Now, before actually, this is an important slide I want to look at here. Before we get to the pragmatic, it is important that we think hard about the descriptive or about the normative task. When we talk about the normative task, it is important that we do that from the vantage point of what is normative of God must be relevant to all people. One way of saying it is, if it's not good news for everybody, it's not good news for anybody. And so this is a way that John Swinton talks about this. If a definition includes the weak and the vulnerable, then this is a strong indication that such an understanding may be concomitant with the God who reveals God's self in the Bible, in the biblical narrative, and especially in the life of Jesus. That is, as a valid theological understanding. In other words, if it includes the weak and the vulnerable, if it does not accept any collateral damage, then it might be a pretty good theological understanding. If, and he continues here, if it in any way excludes such people, then it must be considered an inauthentic representation of the God who secures justice for the poor and upholds the cause of the needy. In other words, in our normative task, we must consider the fact that for the God revealed in Jesus Christ, the God who was executed on a cross outside the gates of Jerusalem. There is no collateral damage. There's no one beyond the reach of God. And so if our normative claims about God are exclusionary, they are incomplete. That is a really important lens for understanding the normative task. Um, so now let's get to the pragmatic. The pragmatic task is the strategic moment. This is also known as the strategic task. This is where we get to make concrete recommendations about what we should do to address the situation in participation with God's action. So now that we have adequately and thickly described, interpreted, and and discerned the action of God in a particular situation, now we can start to understand what we should have done differently or what we should do differently moving forward. So if we're thinking about worship and sacrament, for example, we are thinking about the ways the church is doing it, why the church is doing it, what ought to be happening, how can we conform our participation in God's action with what God is actually doing in the world? And then let's think differently about what we should do differently. I'll give you a quick example of where this becomes a really important question. During the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, there was a huge need for churches to not meet in person the way we had before. To protect each other for a temporary time, we had to stop worshiping in person. It was Most churches discerned that that was just the best way of caring for their community. And what made that really difficult is now we had to ask in a completely new way, how are we supposed to worship? So a way of looking at that is that to describe the situation, we have this pandemic. People cannot gather together in person, and so we need to ask why this is happening. So you bring in, in that situation, we're going to look at sociological factors. We're definitely going to look at some biological factors, the actual spread of disease, things like that. But more importantly, we're going to ask, questions about how human beings interact with each other and interact with God, and that leads us into that normative task. What is worship? Can worship even make sense if we're not in physical proximity to each other? If, for example, how on earth are we going to take communion? If the bread and the cup are the body and blood of Jesus Christ, how is this going to work? And so theologians had to engage in these practices, the four tasks of practical theology, to consider, okay, what should we do? And many churches decided that there was a way, in a provisional sense, to take communion online. And it was, of course, highly debated. And some churches made the decision based on their process that they needed to take a break from the sacraments because the necessity of the physical was so important. And so this is an example of the different ways people engaged in that process had to ask very concrete questions about their worship and sacrament because of the situation that they were in. So that necessitated a disciplined process of practical theology. And so the pragmatic is where you decide this is what we should do. Should we take communion or should we not? Should we invite people to go to their pantries and get some bread out to do it on screen, or do we not? These are pragmatic questions. But the point is that in practical theology, we always want to ground what we do in the concrete and lived experience, which means we are going to provide some claims about how to do this. Now, it's really important to say, again, a good argument for why we use the normative task at all as a term is because the pragmatic is not normative. What we say as a concrete recommendation is never a prescription, a final, this is how it must always be done for all eternity or anything like that. What's normative is God's action, not ours. So these are the four tasks of practical theology, and this is how I just find it really helpful to organize my thinking around these four tasks. Again, not so much as a model, but as a rubric per se. If we're doing practical theology well, we're doing it with these four tasks in operation. So that is. basically how I understand practical theology and how I'd encourage you to organize your thinking, not only academically in writing. If you're assigned a paper on practical theology, this is a good way to kind of assess whether you're doing it well. But also as ministers, if you're in a church, if you're a leader in a church, if you're a layperson in a church, whoever you are, uh, this is a good disciplined way to make sure that we're not skipping around or jumping to conclusions. It is, I think, such a powerful temptation to think, okay, I've described the situation. Now I know how to fix it. I'll just fix it without pausing and reflecting on where God is, prayerfully doing that. Remember that doxological element that Moltmann talked about, is that theology must be done as praise, and therefore, I think as prayer. We need to pause and pray and think through our actions as ministers and as theologians. I hope this has been a helpful overview of practical theology as I understand it. Of course, there are other ways of describing these things, but hopefully you find this to be a helpful one because I certainly have. So, thank you very much, and blessings in your ministry.